What up, YouTube? This your boy Javon, and you're tuned into another installment of Context Matters. So tonight I want to jump into the DeLorean and take you back to a very, very, very crucial and detrimental moment in my life. It was definitely a life-altering moment, and it kind of precedes one of the other videos that I've already created. And so when it kind of butts up against it, I'll point it out. Um, so, like millions of other kids in the inner city, I was unfortunate. I had the misfortune of having a mother who was addicted to crack cocaine and an alcoholic, and who did a wide variety of unsavory things that I'll leave to the imagination. But one thing that really, really weighed on me was how she chose to stay in the company and keep me in the company of a man who, at that particular point in time, as far as I'm concerned, was the beginning of her long, drawn out demise. And so, when I was 10 years old, I ran away from my mother for the last time. It wasn't my first time running away, but typically I would just run over to a friend's house and just kind of hide out, gather my thoughts, figure out, what I was going to do in the situation, and then I would find my way back. Now, by the time I was 10 years old, my mother was really, really deeply in love, and just caught up in the allure of this one gentleman who was a neighborhood dope dealer in the city we were living in. And actually, from what I've heard, he was a pretty well established and feared drug dealer. All I know is that at some point he had moved into the house, the one and only place that my mother and I had stayed in together when I was 9 years old. And within a year, they had moved out. We had got kicked out of that place and moved into another place, which was basically a dope house, right? And so I was 10 years old and I was living on the other side of town, and it was a new beginning for me. My mom had sold me on the fact we were going to be able to start over. I didn't like the guy out the gate. I had favored and gained an affinity for the guy that she was dating prior to meeting him, but for whatever reason that didn't work out, and so she chose to be with this guy. And so at 9 years old, I knew that he was a drug dealer because there was times when I would go into their room to sneak around and look for like snacks to eat or whatever, and I would pull out a box and they had crack cocaine in there, all bagged up in little individual little baggies, or there'd be baking soda underneath the kitchen sink. And he was always coming in flashing a whole bunch of money. And like I said, there were people coming in and out of the place that I knew were dope heads. The one thing I didn't know for a little while was that my mom was hooked on crack. But once I figured that out, a lot of things changed because she tried to. She obviously went into denial and tried to make me feel like I was imagining it. And then when I finally found her crack pipe for the first time, she told me that she had just tried it one time, that it wasn't for her. And so that was just the beginning of a real, real tumultuous time for me. But here it was, he moved us to the outskirts of town, right? And still had a lot of traffic, still had a lot of people coming back and forth. I even had a guy working underneath him that used to come by and kind of stay and babysit me, when they went out to go handle the business or go out to a night in the town or what have you. But one of the things that comes along with being in a house with someone who sells drugs is that you typically have a lot of fast money around you. So one of the things that he did try to do is he did try to appease me and buy my attention by buying these gifts. And more specifically, he would buy gifts for the house. He wouldn't outright buy them for me. Like he would buy, he bought a Nintendo back when the Nintendo was the must-have item. He was buying all kind of games. It was his, but he said I could play it. He bought bikes, for himself and for me. clothes. When you live in that fast life, money comes and goes. He was always spending money on my mom, and they were, just living that fast life. But another thing that came along with that is that there was violence in the household. And I remember the very first time that he had put his hands on her, right? She was very dismissive of it. And of course, told me to leave the room. And when I went out of the room, I could hear her saying stuff to the effect of, please don't do that in front of him. And they got into it and what have you. But over the course of the relationship, it was not an uncommon thing for them to get into a disagreement or something, and him to, like, ram her head into, like, the kitchen cabinet, or slap her upside the head, or, like, grab her up by the back of her neck. And with each month of us living with him, he became more and more emboldened and more in control. Now, the one thing he never really tried to do was control me, and I thank God for that. He didn't discipline me, but his way of getting to me if I did something that he didn't like is he would not allow me to use the video games, or to ride the bike, or to wear the clothes that he bought, what have you. And so when we were having good days, it was a great day. When we were having bad days in the house, it was terrible. But again, I was trying to adjust to this new environment, living in the outskirts of town, had moved to a third elementary school in the same year. And so I was desperate to make friends. And so there were lots of kids that would play out in the courtyard. And so three kids in particular took a liking to me. And I really, looking back at it, realized why they befriended me. And it wasn't because they were really interested in me, but they liked being able to come up in the house and play video games. And one of the games that we would always play was the Mike Tyson Punch Out. That was the game next to Mario that we always sat up and played. So it became a routine and a ritual, right? It was to the point where we would actually race from school. The school was maybe about 6 or 7 city blocks from the apartment complex that we lived in. And it was no thing for us to all come up into, the 3 or 4 of us to come up into the house and just pile up in my room. My mom, for the most part, insisted that we did our homework first, but we would just speed through our homework, write down whatever answers, whatnot. And once we were done, she would get us a snack or what have you. And then we'd play video games until he came back. And oftentimes when he came back, he wanted to clear the house because, like I said, he had people coming through buying dope. And the reason I know that, looking back in retrospect, I seen money change hands. I seen bags that were backpacks with what I believe to be drugs exchanged. A lot of guys came in looking nice and sharp and fresh and crisp, real player like. And that was just the environment. There was always somebody there. I recall times where I would come in and he would be cutting up the dope, or he would have my mom and her friend, which was a neighbor that lived downstairs, cutting up the dope right there. Now, I didn't see them cook it up, but like I said, being able to look back and knowing what I know now, I would come in and they would be at the kitchen table with these big mounds of crack cocaine. They'd have the razor and they'd be cutting it up. I didn't know what it was, to be honest with you, because I didn't know what crack rock looked like. But again, I'm able now to look at it through an adult lens and to see the things that throughout my childhood I was so naive to, yet they had an impact on my life. And so there was one day that changed my life forever. And so I remember that we were at school, and of course the bell rang, time to go home. It was me, this guy named Deshaun, this guy named D'Amico, and this one guy named Marcus. And we were walking the whole time. We were talking about how we were gonna finally beat Super Macho Man, because in Mike Tyson Punch Out, for those of you guys that can reflect on that old pastime, you would have to beat a certain guys and you get a code, right? And we would write the code down so we wouldn't have to start over from the beginning. But we couldn't beat Super Macho Man. So we're sitting there talking about strategies of how to beat Super Macho Man, walking to the house, right? We got to the apartment complex. I think we lived on the 3rd floor. I want to say with a great deal of certainty, I believe it was the 3rd floor, because my mom's friend and the other dude that was like an underling for the guy that worked underneath them. They were down beneath us, but they were not at floor level. So we're on the third floor. And so one afternoon, we're walking, getting to the complex. We're just talking like kids about who was gonna finally be the one to beat him. We walk up the stairs, right? I take out the key because at that point I was a latchkey kid. They would be gone out doing their things. They would come back, right? And so I unlocked the door. I had my friends right behind me, had my backpack on. I mean, I'm turning, I'm talking to them, having a great old time. Unlocked the door without even really paying attention. And when I opened the door, all I saw was the guy, right? And so I seen his back, and he's a really, really uh, robust guy, and he had a jerry curl back then. His build reminds me of Suge Knight, so I use Suge Knight as a reference point. He was a really, really big, husky guy. He's one of those guys that was not like flabby fat, but he was big and round, right? And he had a long jerry curl, and all I could see was him. And I remember he had on some shorts, and he had on like a Hawaii 5-0 or a Miami Vice kind of shirt. It's real, color print on it, some sort of leaves or what have you. And I didn't know what was going on. I seen his back, and he was like standing up over the couch. And as I walk in the door, I take a couple steps in, and they were right behind me. They come walking in, and I could see once I got in that my mom was underneath him, like crouching, like trying to cover up. And in that moment, he didn't know that I came in the door because he's yelling and screaming, talking about, Gloria, where the F is my dope? Where the fuck is my dope? And so he's literally slapping her and pulling her hair out. She had rollers in her hair. And I remember seeing him pulling out the rollers and her hair coming out in the rollers, and then literally falling on the carpet because we had bone white carpet. And I could see the hair in his hand as he's pulling the rollers out and grabbing her and slapping her. I hear the slaps. It's like literally like I can still remember his hand going across her face and across her head. And so as I'm standing there, I'm immediately froze. In the moment, I panic. I'm just looking, right? I feel my friends bump up against me because they weren't prepared for me to stop. But then I see my mom like lean around him as she's trying to cover up, and he's hitting her and she's crying. And she's like, no, JoJo's here. And so I look at her looking around his big, huge body, and I can see the whole side of her face is just like bloody. Like I can see from her nose down. I mean, just like, not like a little bit of a cut lip, but I mean where blood is coming down and dripping down onto the actual robe that she was wearing. And he turned and looked at me as he's still grabbing her hair and hitting her. And he's like, y'all little niggas go in the room. Get in the room. And I just remember looking at him and just being completely in a panic. Like I could not bring my body to move. And at some point, I hear my friends looking around me and seeing exactly what's going on. I hear her screaming that don't do this in front of him. Don't do this in front of his kids. He even has these kids. He even has his friends here. Don't do this. And him saying, you crackhead, you know, smoked up all my dope. Where the hell what the fuck is my dope at? XYZ. And then just instantly, I just felt a flush of blood just running through my body. And all I could do was drop my backpack off my shoulder. So I dropped my backpack off my shoulder, and I literally turned around and I weaved and I ran around all three, Marcus and Deshaun and D'Amico, and just ran down the stairs. Just took off. Pew, right? I run down the stairs, out the complex. I run down around the complex. I run down like 3 or 4 blocks. I mean, just hauling ass, just running, crying, out of breath, embarrassed, scared for my mom. And I go to the bowling alley, right? So I go into the bowling alley, and at that point in time, they had payphones. I'm dating myself. I'm an old dude. They had payphones. I ran to the bowling alley, and I begged the person at the counter, the lady, she saw me crying. I asked her, could I please get a quarter? So she reaches she hits the button, boom, 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 opens up the till, gives me like 3 or 4 quarters, right? And she's like, you all right? And so I said, no, my mom's boyfriend's beating out my mom. And she's like, where? I think she thought that like he was out, they were like outside of the bowling alley. So I run outside, I go to the payphone, put the quarter in. I called my grandmother. My grandmother at this point in time was still working. She hadn't retired yet, so she worked for the Washington State Liquor Board. So I called her up, and she answered the phone, and I tell her, I'm like, "Hey, Charles is beating on my mom," and she's like, "What are you talking about? Where you at? You at the house?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not at the house. I'm at the bowling alley." So of course she's like, "What are you doing at the bowling alley?" I'm like, "I'm trying to tell you, Charles is beating on my mom." And she's like, "Where's she at? Where are you guys at?" And I'm like, "I'm at the bowling alley and they're at the house." And so I said, I need you to come get me." So she's like, "I can't come get you right now. I'm still at work." And so she's like, "Well, we go back to the house and then I'll come by after work." And I'm like, "Grandma, I'm not going back to that house." And she's like trying to talk to me, trying to persuade me to go back to the house. And I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm going to stay here. There's no way I'm going back there." And so at some point, she was like, she's going to try and call and see if she can get off early to come and see what's going on. And what I remember is that I got off the phone. I just literally just went over and sat on the curb. The lady that worked in the bowling alley came outside at that point with some dude. I'm assuming co-worker, manager, somebody. And again, I think that she thought that there was something going on in the parking lot because they came out and they're looking around, and I could see them walking. I heard them walking behind me as they walked around, like looking around the building to see. And then the dude asked me, was I all right? But by that time, I hadn't even really realized it, but I really was sitting down. I had my head in my lap with my knees up, and I was just crying. Right? I mean, tears were just flowing. And so he was asking me, was I all right? And he's like, "Where's your mom at?" And I was like, "She's at home." And he's like, "Where's home?" And I couldn't even form the words to even say the address or even to do anything. All I did was I just pointed in the general direction. And so I stayed there. And of course, the lady came and tried to console me and asked me if I want to come back inside. I could sit inside. And the gentleman finally went in. I was like, "No, I'm fine. Just leave me alone. Please leave me alone." So the lady was at least nice enough to stay out there with me. Like, she gave me my space. She stayed in the general area. She sat down, and she just watched over me as I just really just came apart. Like I said, I just remember just feeling so distraught. I didn't know what was really going on, why he was beating on her at that point in time. I didn't even stop to think, that I left my friends right there in the middle of my living room with this whole thing going on. And then when I thought about it, it just immediately made me even more embarrassed. And I was thinking to myself, I can't go back to school. I can't go back and face them. I can't allow myself to be compromised in that way. And so I don't know how long I stayed there. I know it was at least an hour or so because the sun set. And when my grandmother came to the bowling alley, one of the first things she came over and told me to get in the car. And of course, by that time I had finished crying. And I was just sitting there, just very, very somber and very, very melancholy, and just, a million thoughts was running through my head. But the two things that I knew without a shadow of a doubt in my heart is that, one, I was never ever going to go back into that house, and that two, I was never ever going to forgive Charles Brown. Those are the two things that I knew without a shadow of a doubt. So my grandmother taught me to get in the car, and she drove to the apartment complex. Right, by the time we get there, Charles is not there. He drove a big brown Cadillac at that point in time, right? And we had designated parking. So I looked and I seen he wasn't there. And so my grandmother was trying to get me to get out the car to go up. I refused. Of course, she got mad and she threatened me. She's like, "No, you need to get out of this car." And you listen to what I said. And I sat there. And I think at some point she just realized I just wasn't going to budge. So she went up in the house, talked to my mom about whatever they talked about, and came outside. And she was under the impression that I was going to just go back in the house. She was like, "He's gone. He's not there. You can go back in to the house." And I was like, "I'm not going back into that house." Right. And so she sat with me. And at first she was very patient about it. But then she started getting upset. And she'd tell me she got to go to work in the morning. And I got to go back in the house. And that my mom got to figure this thing out. And I was telling her no. I was like, "Well, I'm going to just call the police. I'll call the police, and then they can come get him." I was thinking getting Charles because I was going to tell him exactly what I saw. And so Eventually, my grandmother talked me into coming into the house to get some clothes. She was like, "You can come to the house, but you need to get some clothes with you so that you can have something to wear to school tomorrow." And at that point, I was like, "No, I'm not going to that school. Like, I'm not going to that school." And she's like, "Yes, you are. You're going to school. You're not going to let something like this. This is your mom's mess." Gave me the whole speech about how it's not my fault. It's my mom's mess, but I got to go to school. And I told her at that point that I can't go back to school because I don't want to see Marcus and D'Amico, right? There's just no way. Dominique was cool, right? But and because I had seen some things going on in this house, but I was really worried about Marcus and D'Amico, to be honest with you, and so it was just one of those things where I was just too embarrassed, and I was like, no. So I went to the house, and as much as she tried to clean up the place, there was still droplets of blood on the bone white carpet over next to the couch. Right, taken the little she had taken the little covers off the couch, and I'm assuming she took them to go put them in the washer and dryer. But you could still see the blood splatters and the blood drippings on the carpet. And I remember looking at that, and it just reminded me that what I seen was real. Like, I was not making this up, right? Because at that point in time, she was trying to downplay it. She was like, "Oh, he just got mad." And so, yeah, he did kind of go over my head, but it wasn't all that serious. He's just making this, he's exaggerating. And I remember arguing with her in front of my grandmother, like telling her, like, "No, I saw it. Like, you were bleeding. I saw him snatching rollers out of your head. I saw him snatching your hair out of your head." And of course, she was like, "No, he didn't." But at the same point in time, she had on like a little, kind of like a little beret kind of hat. And I was like, "Well, take off the hat then. Show grandma your hair. Show her your hair." And by that point in time, my grandmother had enough. So she was like, "Well, if you coming with me for the night, then you need to get your clothes. You need to go." So they negotiated that I was going to go stay with my grandmother for the night, and she would come back. She would go to school late. Not school, excuse me. She would go to work late, but she would come and drop me off at school, to which point I was adamantly against. And I told her there that I wasn't going to do it. But the plan was for her to drop me off at school and then double back and go to work. And so I left the house. I remember that as I was leaving the house, my mom and I didn't even have a conversation at all. It wasn't no, she didn't at all address the anger that I was exhibiting. She did not at all address the hurt that I was exhibiting. She did not even take the time to recognize just how impactful this event was on me, and that up to that point I had never really been adamant with her. I had never pressed a hard line with her. But the way I was talking to her when I was trying to get my grandmother to believe that what I saw was what I saw, and she's trying to downplay it. And the more that I was trying to tell my grandmother that she's on drugs and she was denying that, like it came to a head where I was literally trying to get my grandmother to see what I seen on a daily basis in this apartment. So my grandma and I left for the night, and that was the beginning of a very, very tumultuous little space and time, because when the next day came, I refused to get up and to get in the bathtub and to get ready for school, which my grandmother decided to combat by giving me a whooping, right, for that, which only exacerbated the whole pain and feeling of hopelessness that had started brewing over the night. I couldn't even sleep. I didn't even sleep that night. All I kept running through my mind was this big dude, like literally hitting and slapping and choking my mom, and I can still remember and the sounds that it made with his big hands slapping across her face, just hearing the blunt force of him hitting her and her screaming out and making these terrible sounds. And so I didn't sleep, and I definitely wasn't going back over there. So my grandmother gave me a whooping that morning, and as I stayed there in the little this guest room, for lack of a better term, because she finally decided she had to go to work, and she told me that when she got back from work, this foolishness was gonna be over. She figured she was gonna fix me that way. I literally stayed there all day in this state of depression. Right, I was wondering where my mom was at that point, and I was wondering if he had came back. I was wondering if me not being there had caused more of a rift between him and her. I wondered if my grandmother truly believed and understood what I was saying. I wondered if D'Amico and them had went to school the next day and told everybody what they seen in that apartment that day. And the craziest part about it is that one, I never ever stepped foot back in that apartment, right? Never stepped foot back into that apartment. Never spoke to these guys ever again, right? And um, I don't know if I ever spoke to Charles Brown again. I think at some point in the future after that, they still stayed together. They did whatever. And I think that he one time, wanted to get on the phone and check in to see how I was doing once I was finally in my grandmother's custody. But I had some real choice words for him at that point in time. And so it's crazy how that went. That this is something that had no ending to it. I did speak with my mom about it, years later when I was adult about it, and of course she was very, very apologetic, and she, let me know that she was in an abusive relationship and she felt trapped, and she had to tell my grandmother that I was lying, and had to make it seem like it wasn't as big of a deal as it was, and even came clean. It was like, yeah, I was hooked on dope, even though I told you that I was a one-time thing. I mean, we had a conversation in which she validated what I knew to be true, but the die was already cast. The way in which it made me view her was something that she could never ever get undo. The way I viewed him is something he can never undo. For all I know, he could be a pastor at a mega church right now. He could have turned his life around, and he could have done all kind of philanthropical work, or he could be a staple in his community, right? He could be one of the best guys that anybody would want to vouch for right now, but he violated and took a piece away from me and subjected me to a cascading snowball effect. That day that I saw that happen to my mom to that magnitude changed the way I saw her. It was the final straw of me living in her house, well, his house, and it was a sticking point. It was a point of contention. He actually is one of the reasons why I just really despise drug dealers, really despise men who prey on women, really despise guys who think that the way they answer temporary anger, bouts of anger, is to be violent towards women, right? I've seen that in many other spaces in my life, but to see him do that to my mom for the first time to that degree, that brutal, right, that heartlessly, and without really even having any remorse. I don't even think that he even apologized. I know for a fact that he didn't apologize to me. The time that she put him on the phone to kind of check up on me and see how I was doing at my grandmother's house, there was no type of remorse. The conversation never even came up. They didn't even acknowledge why I was there. It's just he wanted to she was like, hey, Charles wants to say, hey, put him on the phone. And he just wanted to engage into a conversation to see how I was doing on the other side of town. I wasn't having that then, right? I stood up for myself then. I advocated for myself then, just as much as I advocate for myself now. But that there was a moment that actually changed the trajectory of my life. It definitely created a rift between my mother and I, and it definitely is something that I held against her for a number of years, right? And so the only good part that came out of it is that I proved to myself that through self-advocacy, I would stand up and say when something was not right and not be pressured to just act as if these types of things were okay. I never allowed anybody to make me feel like the way I felt wasn't valid, wasn't justified, wasn't real. I realized that I could be and I had to be the only support system for myself that I needed. And at that point, I really started to distrust being able to trust other people, After that, I mean, I went through letdown after letdown after letdown after letdown. But that one right there prepared me and opened my eyes to the fact that the people who were supposed to protect me and were supposed to look out for me, supposed to love me, and supposed to guide me in a positive way, found ways to, burden me with insecurity, with fearfulness, with this sense of hopelessness, with all these things that a young person, let alone a young child, should not have to internalize, should not have to find a way to cope with, right? I should have been able to just move around in my childhood naivety and to be able to have that little sense of childhood, right? But I had to grow up real fast, and I had to decide real quick that I was going to be the only one to really look out for myself. My grandmother wasn't going to be the one. That was apparent to me, right? My mother had proved to not be strong enough to be that to me. And so I had, at that point, had to adopt these coping mechanisms that would prepare me to be able to combat anytime someone put me in one of these positions. So that ties into what I had said before, because I had detailed how I had to I was going to go into temporary foster care if my grandmother hadn't stepped up and went ahead and took guardianship over me. But then again, as I had related then, I had to advocate for myself. I had to be adamant. I had to be stubborn. I had to be persistent, and I had to be unwavering. Right. So I was developing these skills that lead you into being a strong person, but it hollowed me out as a person. Right. In order to really be able to utilize those tools in order to protect myself, I had to sacrifice and give up a nice, warm, loving space inside of me. I had to give up trust. I had to give up the desire to really want to open up to other people and to be myself. There was no way that I could do both at the same time. And so, as a survival mechanism, I adopted these things to get me through these hard times. And so, I say all this to say there are people out here that have had experiences like this. There's people out here who have had experiences that are worse than this. But the common thread that we share is that in order to make your way through these types of traumas, there's only two ways to go about it. Either you self-medicate and you find a way to run away from it, right? You find a way to mask all these things, or you got to compartmentalize these things and you got to keep mashing. And so I spent my life being a masher, ladies and gentlemen, right? Good, bad, ugly, right? I always got my own back. And so here's some of the origins of where I had to develop that type of coping mechanism. So if you made it to this point of me sharing this recollection, I appreciate you being here, listening to my words. It means a lot to me. Until the next episode, peace.